radio crackled with desperation. "We're pinned down. They're everywhere." The voice belonged to Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, leader of a six-man Army Ranger reconnaissance team trapped in a narrow valley in Afghanistan's Kunar province. What started as a routine patrol had become a nightmare. 50 Taliban fighters had them surrounded, and ammunition was running low. 800 meters away, perched on a rocky outcrop with her rifle, Staff Sergeant Sarah Chun felt her heart pound as she peered through her scope. The math was simple and terrifying. 6 Rangers against 50 enemy fighters. The odds were impossible. But Sarah had something the enemy didn't expect, a gift for precision shooting that would be tested like never before. As bullets whizzed past the trapped Rangers below, Sarah steadied her breathing. At 1,200 meters, most snipers wouldn't even attempt the shot. The wind was gusting, the heat created shimmer effects, and the targets were moving. But those Rangers were depending on her. She had trained for moments like this her entire military career, though she never imagined facing odds this overwhelming. "I've got eyes on multiple targets," Sarah whispered into her radio. Beginning engagement. What happened next would become legend among Special Operations Forces. One woman, one rifle, and a series of shots that would change everything. This is the true story of how Staff Sergeant Sarah Chun turned the tide of battle against impossible odds, earning her place in military history and saving 6 lives in the process. The sun was setting over the Hindu Kush Mountains, and time was running out. Sarah Chun never planned to become one of the most feared snipers in Afghanistan. Growing up in a small Oregon town, she was the daughter of immigrant parents who owned a local restaurant. Her father, a former engineer from Taiwan, had taught her patience and precision through hours of chess games at their kitchen table. Her mother, originally from South Korea, instilled in her a fierce determination and the belief that with enough practice, anything was possible. The path to the military began during her senior year of high school, when an Army recruiter visited her school. Sarah had been struggling to find direction after graduation. College seemed expensive and uncertain, and she felt restless in her small hometown. When the recruiter talked about opportunities for travel, education, and serving something bigger than herself, Sarah felt a spark of interest she hadn't experienced before. Her parents were initially worried. They had immigrated to America hoping their daughter would have a peaceful, stable life far from conflict. But they also recognized the strong-willed determination in Sarah that they had both inherited and nurtured. After weeks of family discussions around that same kitchen table where she had learned patience, they gave their blessing with the understanding that she would be careful and come home safely. Basic training at Fort Benning was brutal but transformative. Sarah discovered she had natural athletic ability and mental toughness that surprised even her drill sergeants. More importantly, she excelled at marksmanship. While other recruits struggled with their rifles, Sarah consistently hit targets that others missed. Her shooting instructor, a gruff veteran named Sergeant First Class Martinez, noticed her potential immediately. "Chun, you've got something special," he told her after a particularly impressive shooting session. "Most people can learn to shoot adequately. Very few have the natural ability to shoot exceptionally. You might want to consider pursuing specialized training." That suggestion changed everything. After completing basic training and advanced individual training as an infantryman, Sarah volunteered for sniper school. The selection process was incredibly demanding, both physically and mentally. Of the 40 soldiers who began the course, only 12 would graduate. Sarah was the only woman in her class, and she felt the weight of proving herself every single day. The training was unlike anything she had experienced. Learning to calculate wind speed and direction, adjusting for temperature and humidity, understanding ballistics at extreme distances, and developing the patience to wait hours or even days for the perfect shot. The mental aspect was equally challenging. Instructors pushed students to their breaking points, testing their ability to think clearly under extreme stress. Sarah's breakthrough moment came during a particularly difficult exercise. Students were required to make a shot at 800 meters while instructors used various distraction techniques, including loud noises, simulated explosions, and psychological pressure. Many students failed multiple attempts. When Sarah's turn came, she closed her eyes briefly, remembering those quiet chess games with her father. She controlled her breathing, blocked out the distractions, and squeezed the trigger. Perfect center hit. From that moment, she gained the respect of both instructors and fellow students. She graduated third in her class and was immediately assigned to a specialized unit that would eventually deploy to Afghanistan. Her reputation for calm under pressure and exceptional accuracy preceded her arrival at her new unit. The deployment to Afghanistan came 8 months later. Sarah's unit was assigned to Forward Operating Base Chapman in Khost Province, a dangerous area known for frequent Taliban activity. The base was surrounded by mountains that provided perfect hiding spots for enemy fighters, and attacks were common. During her first month in country, Sarah participated in routine patrols and security operations. She quickly adapted to the harsh terrain and extreme conditions. The mountains reminded her of camping trips in Oregon, though the constant threat of enemy contact was entirely new. She learned to read the landscape like a tactical map, identifying potential sniper positions and escape routes. Her first confirmed kill came during her 6th week in Afghanistan. A Taliban fighter had been taking shots at American patrols from a compound 600 meters away. After 2 unsuccessful attempts by other snipers, Sarah was given the assignment. She spent 3 hours in position, waiting for the perfect shot. When the enemy fighter finally exposed himself, Sarah's shot was immediate and decisive. The threat was eliminated, and the patrol was able to continue safely. Word of her marksmanship spread quickly among the units in the area. Commanders began specifically requesting her support for difficult missions. Sarah found herself becoming the go-to sniper for situations that required extreme precision or long-distance shots. She took pride in her work, but also felt the weight of responsibility that came with it. The mission that would define her military career began on a hot Tuesday morning in July. Intelligence reports indicated increased Taliban activity in the Kunar province, particularly in a valley known for its strategic importance. The area provided access to supply routes between Afghanistan and Pakistan, making it valuable to both sides. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez's 6-man reconnaissance team was tasked with gathering intelligence about enemy positions and movements in the valley. Sarah was assigned as Overwatch, positioned on a rocky outcrop approximately 800 meters from the team's planned route. Her mission was to provide security and eliminate any threats that might endanger the patrol. The morning briefing was routine. Weather conditions were favorable, with clear skies and light winds. The reconnaissance team would move through the valley in a standard patrol formation, gathering information and reporting back to base. Sarah would maintain visual contact and radio communication throughout the mission. What intelligence reports hadn't revealed was the size of the Taliban force operating in the area. Unknown to the American forces, a large group of fighters had been moving through the region for several days, preparing for a coordinated attack on American positions. The timing of the reconnaissance patrol couldn't have been worse. As Sarah settled into her position that morning, checking her equipment and adjusting her scope, she had no idea that she was about to face the most challenging situation of her military career. The radio was quiet, the sun was climbing higher in the sky, and everything seemed routine. In the valley below, Sergeant Rodriguez's team began their patrol, moving carefully through the rocky terrain. They had no way of knowing that 50 Taliban fighters were already in position, waiting for the perfect moment to spring their trap. The stage was set for a battle that would test every skill Sarah had learned and push her beyond anything she thought possible. The morning started like any other, but by sunset, everything would change. Sarah would discover just how far her training and determination could take her when faced with impossible odds. The quiet Oregon girl who learned patience at a kitchen table was about to become a legend. The first sign of trouble came at 10:47 a.m. Sarah was scanning the valley through her scope when she noticed movement that didn't belong. Small flashes of light reflecting off metal, too coordinated to be accidental. Her training immediately kicked in as she recognized what she was seeing: enemy fighters positioning themselves in a classic ambush formation. Overwatch to patrol leader, Sarah whispered into her radio, her voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through her system. I'm seeing possible enemy movement at multiple positions. You might want to adjust your route. Sergeant Rodriguez's voice came back calm and professional. Copy that, Overwatch. Can you give us specifics on numbers and locations? Sarah continued her scan, methodically checking each potential hiding spot she had identified during her earlier reconnaissance. What she discovered made her blood run cold. This wasn't a small group of opportunistic fighters. This was a coordinated force. She could see muzzle flashes being positioned in rocks, behind trees, and in natural defensive positions that would give the enemy overlapping fields of fire. Patrol leader, I count at least 30 fighters in position. This looks like a planned ambush. Recommend immediate withdrawal to your current position. But before Rodriguez could respond, the silence of the morning was shattered by automatic weapons fire. The Taliban had sprung their trap early, perhaps spooked by the patrol's cautious movement. From her elevated position, Sarah could see muzzle flashes erupting from positions throughout the valley. The 6 Rangers were caught in a deadly crossfire with nowhere to go. Contact! Contact! We're taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Rodriguez's voice crackled over the radio, barely audible over the sound of gunfire. Request immediate support. Sarah's scopes swept across the battlefield, trying to assess the situation. The Rangers had taken cover behind a cluster of large rocks, but their position was exposed from at least 3 directions. Enemy fighters were moving to flank them, and it was only a matter of time before they would be overrun. The distance to the nearest enemy position was 650 meters, a challenging shot, but well within Sarah's capabilities. She acquired her first target, a Taliban fighter who was moving to a position that would give him a clear shot at the trapped Rangers. Sarah controlled her breathing, adjusted for wind and distance, and squeezed the trigger. The shot was perfect. The enemy fighter dropped immediately, causing confusion among the other Taliban positions. For a moment, the incoming fire slackened as the enemy tried to figure out where the shot had come from. But the respite was brief. Within seconds, the attack resumed with even greater intensity. Good shot, Overwatch. Rodriguez called over the radio. But we need more help. They're everywhere. Sarah was already acquiring her next target. A group of 3 fighters were attempting to move closer to the Rangers' position, using natural cover to advance undetected. At 800 meters, it was a more difficult shot, especially with the heat beginning to create atmospheric distortion. Sarah made the necessary adjustments and fired again. Another direct hit. The remaining 2 fighters in that group immediately sought better cover, disrupting their planned advance. But even as Sarah eliminated individual threats, she could see that the overall situation was deteriorating rapidly. More enemy fighters were emerging from concealment, and their numbers were far greater than her initial estimate. Patrol leader, I'm now counting approximately 50 enemy fighters. This is much larger than intelligence indicated. You need immediate air support and reinforcement. Rodriguez's response was grim. Overwatch, air support is at least 20 minutes out. We need to hold this position until then. Can you keep providing fire support? Sarah was already scanning for her next target. The Taliban fighters had realized they were being engaged by a sniper and were being more cautious about exposing themselves. This made her job more difficult, but not impossible. She had to be patient and wait for opportunities. A Taliban fighter made the mistake of exposing himself while trying to get a better angle on the Rangers. At 900 meters, it was pushing the limits of her equipment, but Sarah had made shots like this before in training. She calculated the ballistic drop, adjusted for the crosswind she could see affecting the vegetation in the valley, and fired. The shot was slightly low, striking the rocks near the enemy fighter but causing him to retreat to a less effective position. Sarah quickly chambered another round and continued scanning. She could see that the enemy was beginning to coordinate their movements more effectively, with some fighters providing covering fire while others attempted to advance. The radio crackled with urgent updates from the trapped Rangers. We're running low on ammunition. Private Johnson is hit. We need that air support now. Sarah felt a surge of urgency. These weren't just fellow soldiers, they were friends. She had trained with some of these men, shared meals with them, listened to their stories about families back home. The thought of them being overrun by enemy forces was unacceptable. She identified a cluster of enemy fighters who were coordinating what appeared to be a flanking maneuver. At 1,050 meters, it would be one of the longest shots she had ever attempted in combat. The atmospheric conditions were becoming more challenging as the sun climbed higher, creating heat shimmer that distorted her view through the scope. Sarah remembered her training about extreme distance shooting. She had to account not only for bullet drop and wind drift, but also for the Coriolis effect at this range. She made her calculations quickly but carefully, knowing that a miss would give away her position and potentially compromise her ability to continue providing support. The shot felt perfect as it left the barrel. Through her scope, Sarah watched the bullet's impact and saw one of the enemy leaders fall. The coordinated attack from that position immediately became disorganized as the fighters lost their leader and sought new cover. But the victory was temporary. The Taliban fighters were learning from each engagement and beginning to adapt their tactics. They started using smoke to conceal their movements and coordinating their attacks more effectively. Sarah realized that she was facing not just random insurgents, but experienced fighters who understood battlefield tactics. Overwatch, they're massing for what looks like a final assault, Rodriguez reported. We're down to our last magazines. Whatever you can do, we need it now. Sarah could see the enemy preparation he was describing. Taliban fighters were moving into position for what appeared to be a coordinated rush on the Rangers' position. If they succeeded in getting close enough for hand-to-hand combat, the 6 Rangers would be quickly overwhelmed. She identified the key leaders organizing the assault and began systematically engaging them. Each shot had to count. There was no room for error and no time for second chances. The lives of 6 American soldiers depended on her ability to disrupt the enemy attack before it could gain momentum. As Sarah settled in for what she knew would be the most challenging shooting of her life, she could hear the intensity of the battle increasing in the valley below. Time was running out, and the enemy was closing in. The next few minutes would determine whether her friends lived or died. The sun was getting higher, making shooting conditions more difficult with each passing moment. But Sarah had trained for this. Every hour on the range, every lesson about patience and precision, every moment of doubt she had overcome during training, it all led to this moment. 6 Rangers were counting on her, and she would not let them down. The situation in the valley had become desperate. Sarah could see through her scope that the Taliban fighters were organizing for what military tacticians call a human wave attack, a coordinated assault using overwhelming numbers to overrun a position. The enemy had realized that time was on their side. American reinforcements would eventually arrive, but if they could eliminate the trapped Rangers quickly, they could disappear into the mountains before facing any serious resistance. Sarah's radio crackled with increasingly urgent reports. Overwatch, we've got wounded, and we're down to our last ammunition. Rodriguez's voice was strained but controlled. Private Johnson needs medical attention. Private Williams took shrapnel in the leg. We can't hold much longer. Through her scope, Sarah could see the Rangers' position more clearly now. They had managed to create a small defensive perimeter behind a cluster of large rocks. But their cover was limited. Enemy fire was coming from at least 8 different positions, creating overlapping fields of fire that made any movement extremely dangerous. The Taliban fighters had positioned themselves expertly, using the natural terrain to their advantage. What made Sarah's situation even more challenging was the distance. Most of the enemy fighters were now positioned between 900 and 1,200 meters from her location. At those ranges, even perfect shots became extremely difficult due to environmental factors. The morning heat was creating atmospheric distortion that made targets appear to shimmer and dance through her scope. Wind conditions were variable, with gusts coming from different directions as air currents bounced off the mountain slopes. Sarah had trained extensively for long-range precision shooting, but training on a controlled range was very different from combat conditions. The stress, the knowledge that lives hung in the balance, and the need to make rapid decisions while maintaining precision. These factors combined to create the most challenging shooting environment possible. She identified what appeared to be a Taliban commander who was coordinating the assault from a position approximately 1,100 meters away. The target was partially concealed behind rocks, with only his upper torso visible for brief moments as he moved to direct his fighters. Sarah would have only seconds to make the shot when he next appeared. The calculations were complex. At 1,100 meters, her bullet would drop approximately 30 inches from the point of aim. The crosswind would push it several inches to the left. The temperature and altitude affected air density, which influenced bullet velocity. Sarah had to factor in all these variables while tracking a moving target under combat stress. When the Taliban commander next exposed himself, Sarah was ready. Her breathing was controlled, her position was stable, and her calculations were complete. The shot felt right as it left the barrel. Through her scope, she watched the bullet's impact and saw the enemy leader fall backward and remain motionless. The coordinated movement from that section of the enemy line immediately became confused and disorganized. "Outstanding shot," Rodriguez called over the radio. That definitely got their attention. But Sarah's success also created a new problem. The Taliban fighters now knew they were being engaged by a skilled sniper at long range. They began using smoke and coordinating their movements to make themselves more difficult targets. Some fighters started moving to new positions that would give them better concealment from Sarah's overwatch position. Sarah realized she needed to change her tactics. Instead of waiting for perfect shots, she needed to maintain constant pressure on the enemy to prevent them from organizing their final assault. She began what snipers call rapid precision fire, shooting quickly but accurately to suppress enemy movement and disrupt their coordination. Her next target was a machine gun position that was delivering devastating fire on the Ranger's position. The gunner was well concealed, but Sarah could see the muzzle flash and smoke from his weapon. At 950 meters, she couldn't see the actual target, but she could calculate his position based on the weapon's signature. This type of shooting required experience and intuition that went beyond basic marksmanship training. Sarah aimed at where she calculated the gunner must be positioned and fired. The machine gun fire stopped immediately. Whether she had hit the gunner or simply forced him to seek better cover, the immediate threat to the Rangers was reduced. She quickly chambered another round and continued scanning for targets. The enemy was adapting quickly to her tactics. Taliban fighters began moving in short rushes, using smoke and natural cover to mask their movements. They were clearly experienced in fighting against American forces and understood the threat that a skilled sniper represented. Sarah realized she was facing opponents who were every bit as tactical and professional as American forces. A group of enemy fighters was attempting to flank the Rangers' position by moving through a dry creek bed that would provide them with concealment until they were within grenade range. Sarah could see occasional glimpses of movement through gaps in the natural cover, but the targets were never exposed long enough for a certain shot. This required a different approach. Instead of waiting for a clear shot, Sarah decided to use suppressive fire to keep the flanking force pinned down in the creek bed. She began firing at intervals into the areas where she had seen movement, not necessarily aiming at specific targets, but creating enough threat to prevent the enemy from advancing. The tactic worked. The flanking movement stopped as the Taliban fighters sought better cover. But Sarah's ammunition was becoming a concern. She had started the mission with standard combat load, but the intensity of the engagement was consuming her rounds faster than anticipated. Every shot had to count not just for accuracy, but for ammunition conservation. "Overwatch, how much longer can you maintain fire support?" Rodriguez asked, as if reading her thoughts. Sarah quickly counted her remaining ammunition. "I've got about 30 rounds left. I need to make them count." The battlefield situation was becoming increasingly complex. Air support was still several minutes away, and the enemy was clearly preparing for a final assault despite their losses. Sarah could see Taliban fighters massing in positions that would allow them to rush the Rangers' defensive perimeter from multiple directions simultaneously. She identified what appeared to be the enemy's senior commander, positioned on a ridge approximately 1,200 meters away. He was coordinating the final assault using hand signals and was clearly the key to the entire enemy operation. Eliminating him might disrupt their attack long enough for air support to arrive. The shot would be at the absolute limit of her rifle's effective range. At 1,200 meters, environmental factors became exponentially more important. A slight miscalculation in wind speed or direction could cause the bullet to miss by several feet. The target was partially concealed and would be exposed for only brief moments. Sarah made her calculations carefully, taking into account everything she had learned about the local wind patterns during the engagement. She could see dust devils in the valley that indicated variable wind conditions. The temperature was continuing to rise, affecting air density and bullet trajectory. When the enemy commander next exposed himself to signal his fighters, Sarah was ready. The shot required perfect timing and execution. She controlled her breathing, made final adjustments for the wind she could see affecting vegetation at various points along the bullet's path, and squeezed the trigger with the precision she had developed through thousands of hours of training. The bullet's flight time at that range was nearly 2 seconds, long enough for doubt to creep in, long enough to wonder if the calculations were correct. Through her scope, Sarah watched the impact and saw the enemy commander fall backward off the ridge. The effect on the Taliban fighters was immediate and dramatic. Without their leader's coordination, the planned assault began to fall apart. Incredible shot. Rodriguez's voice carried both amazement and relief. Their whole line just stopped advancing. But Sarah knew the reprieve was temporary. The enemy still had overwhelming numerical superiority, and eventually, local Taliban leaders would restore order and resume the attack. She needed to continue applying pressure while conserving her remaining ammunition for the most critical targets. The next few minutes would determine whether her marksmanship could hold off 50 enemy fighters long enough for help to arrive. Sarah chambered another round and continued scanning for targets, knowing that each shot might be the difference between life and death for 6 American soldiers. With their senior commander eliminated, the Taliban force had momentarily lost coordination, but Sarah knew this advantage wouldn't last long. Through her scope, she could see enemy fighters regrouping under new leadership. The assault on the Rangers' position was being reorganized, and time was running out faster than her ammunition supply. Sarah's radio crackled with an update that made her heart sink. Overwatch, air support has been delayed. Mechanical problems with the lead aircraft. We're looking at least another 15 minutes before anyone can reach us. 15 minutes. In sustained combat, that might as well be 15 hours. Sarah quickly counted her remaining rounds. 23 left. With 50 enemy fighters still active in the valley, the mathematics were not encouraging. She would need to make every single shot count and hope that precision could overcome overwhelming odds. The new Taliban commander had learned from observing Sarah's previous engagements. Instead of exposing his fighters for coordinated movements, he was sending them forward in small groups using maximum concealment. This made Sarah's job significantly more difficult because she couldn't predict where threats would emerge or when targets would present themselves. A muzzle flash caught her attention from a position she hadn't previously identified. An enemy fighter had moved during the confusion and was now in a location that gave him a direct line of sight to the Rangers' position. At 875 meters, it was a challenging shot because the target was mostly concealed behind vegetation, with only occasional glimpses visible. Sarah waited patiently for the right moment, remembering her father's chess lessons about patience and timing. When the enemy fighter shifted position to get a better angle on the Rangers, Sarah was ready. Her shot was perfect, and the threat was eliminated before he could inflict casualties on the trapped patrol. But eliminating individual targets wasn't enough anymore. Sarah realized she needed to think strategically about how to use her remaining ammunition. Instead of simply reacting to immediate threats, she needed to identify the key positions and leaders that were organizing the enemy assault. Through careful observation, she identified 3 positions that appeared to be rally points for the Taliban fighters. These locations provided good cover and communication lines that allowed enemy leaders to coordinate their scattered forces. If she could eliminate the fighters controlling these positions, she might be able to fragment the enemy force into smaller, less coordinated groups. The first position was approximately 1,050 meters away, where a Taliban leader was using hand signals to direct fighters into assault positions. Sarah had observed this individual coordinating multiple groups and recognized him as a key tactical leader. Taking him out would disrupt at least one entire section of the enemy force. The shot required precise calculation because the target was moving frequently and was partially concealed by natural cover. Sarah tracked his movement pattern and identified a spot where he consistently paused to observe the Ranger's position. When he next moved to that location, she was ready. Her shot was perfectly timed and placed. The enemy leader dropped immediately, and Sarah could see the fighters under his command become confused and seek cover rather than continuing their advance. One section of the coordinated assault had been effectively neutralized. The second key position was a machine gun nest that had been repositioned to provide covering fire for the planned assault. At 920 meters, Sarah could see the weapon's muzzle flash and could calculate the gunner's position even though he was well concealed. This was another example of shooting that relied on experience and tactical understanding rather than simply seeing a clear target. Sarah aimed at where her experience told her the gunner must be positioned and fired. The machine gun went silent immediately. Whether she had hit the gunner or simply made his position untenable, the immediate effect was to remove a significant source of supporting fire for the enemy assault. The third critical position was the most challenging. A Taliban spotter was directing mortar fire from a position approximately 1,180 meters away. He was extremely well concealed and exposed himself only for brief moments to observe the Ranger's position and communicate with his mortar team. Eliminating him would stop the indirect fire that was making the Ranger's position increasingly untenable. This shot required everything Sarah had learned about patience, precision, and tactical thinking. The target was at the limit of her effective range, was minimally exposed, and appeared only at irregular intervals. Sarah had to predict when he would next expose himself and be ready to take an instantaneous shot. After observing his pattern for several minutes, Sarah identified a rhythm to his movements. Every 3 to 4 minutes, he would expose himself to get a clear view of the Ranger's position for spotting purposes. Sarah positioned herself and made her calculations, then waited for the next opportunity. When the spotter next appeared, Sarah's shot was immediate and decisive. At 1,180 meters, it was one of the longest successful shots of her military career. The mortar fire that had been harassing the Rangers stopped immediately, giving them some relief from the indirect fire threat. With the elimination of these 3 key leaders, the Taliban assault began to lose coordination. Instead of a unified attack, Sarah could see multiple small groups operating independently. This made them less effective, but also more unpredictable. She couldn't anticipate where the next threat would emerge. Outstanding work, Overwatch. Rodriguez called over the radio. We can see the difference in their coordination, but they're still massing for an assault. We count at least 30 fighters still active. 30 fighters against 6 Rangers, with Sarah providing support from long range. The odds were still overwhelming, but they had improved significantly. Sarah's tactical elimination of key leaders had bought them time and reduced the enemy's effectiveness. But her ammunition situation was becoming critical. Only 16 rounds remaining. Sarah realized she needed to change her approach again. Instead of trying to eliminate every threat, she needed to focus on preventing the enemy from massing for a coordinated assault. This meant using harassment fire to keep enemy groups separated and unable to coordinate effectively. She began engaging targets of opportunity, not necessarily to eliminate them but to force them to seek cover and prevent them from advancing. A Taliban fighter attempting to move between positions would find himself under accurate sniper fire and would be forced to remain in place. Enemy leaders trying to coordinate multiple groups would come under fire whenever they exposed themselves for communication. This psychological warfare was as important as the physical elimination of targets. The Taliban fighters were beginning to realize that any movement, any exposure, any attempt to coordinate brought immediate and accurate sniper fire. This created a paralysis that prevented them from organizing an effective assault. But Sarah knew this tactic had limitations. Eventually, desperation or leadership would overcome the psychological pressure, and the enemy would mass for an assault regardless of casualties. When that happened, her 16 remaining rounds would need to stop 30 determined fighters from overrunning 6 wounded and exhausted Rangers. The radio brought another update that tested Sarah's resolve. Overwatch, Private Johnson's condition is deteriorating. We need medical evacuation immediately. How much longer can you keep them off us? Sarah looked at her remaining ammunition and calculated the odds. 16 rounds against 30 fighters at ranges between 800 and 1,200 meters, under increasingly difficult atmospheric conditions, with the knowledge that wounded Americans were depending on her accuracy. I'll keep them off you, she responded simply. Air support will get here. Just hold your position. As Sarah chambered another round and continued scanning for targets, She knew the next few minutes would test every skill she had developed and every lesson she had learned. The girl who had learned patience at a kitchen table in Oregon was about to face the ultimate test of precision shooting under pressure. The sun was climbing higher, the heat was increasing atmospheric distortion, and 30 Taliban fighters were preparing to overwhelm 6 American Rangers. Sarah Chun was all that stood between them and disaster. The sound that every combat soldier dreads echoed across the valley, the high-pitched whistle that indicated incoming mortar rounds. Despite Sarah's successful elimination of the primary spotter, the Taliban had repositioned their mortar team and resumed indirect fire on the Rangers' position. The trapped soldiers had nowhere to go, pinned down by direct fire from multiple directions, and now facing renewed mortar attacks. Incoming! Incoming! Rodriguez's voice was urgent as explosions erupted around the Rangers' defensive position. Dust and smoke filled the air, temporarily obscuring Sarah's view through her scope. When the air cleared, she could see that the enemy had used the mortar barrage as cover to advance their fighters to closer positions. Sarah's tactical situation had become exponentially more difficult. The Taliban fighters were now positioned at ranges between 400 and 800 meters from the Rangers, meaning they were closer to Sarah's friends but also moving beyond the optimal range for her precision rifle. Some targets were now close enough that traditional sniper techniques were less effective than rapid engagement of multiple threats. Through her scope, Sarah could see that this was the final assault. Taliban fighters were emerging from concealment in coordinated groups, moving quickly from cover to cover while maintaining suppressive fire on the Rangers' position. The enemy had learned from their earlier losses and was now using proper small unit tactics, alternating movement and covering fire, multiple approach routes, and overwhelming firepower. Sarah's remaining 16 rounds would need to stop at least 30 fighters who were now advancing with determination and tactical skill. The mathematics were simple. She would need to achieve a kill ratio that approached perfection, with virtually no room for missed shots or wounded targets who could continue fighting. The first group of Taliban fighters was moving along the northern approach to the Rangers' position. 5 fighters using leapfrog tactics, with 3 providing covering fire while 2 advanced, then reversing roles. At 650 meters, Sarah could engage them, but the targets were moving and using cover effectively. Sarah chose her first target carefully, the fighter who appeared to be leading the assault group. When he paused behind cover to signal his team's next movement, Sarah was ready. Her shot was perfectly placed, and the leader dropped immediately. The remaining 4 fighters in that group immediately sought better cover, and their advance slowed significantly. But even as Sarah engaged the northern group, she could see southern and western approaches developing simultaneously. The Taliban had learned that single-axis attacks failed against her overwatch fire, so they were now attacking from multiple directions to divide her attention and overwhelm her ability to engage all threats. A machine gun team was setting up in a position that would give them a clear field of fire on the Rangers while being partially concealed from Sarah's position. At 720 meters, she could see the assistant gunner moving to set up the weapon's tripod. Sarah knew that once that machine gun was operational, it would deliver devastating fire on the trapped Rangers. Her shot caught the assistant gunner as he was positioning the weapon's legs. The heavy machine gun tumbled down the rocky slope, putting that crew out of action. But Sarah could see that another machine gun team was moving to a different position, and her ammunition count was dropping rapidly. 14 rounds remaining. The radio crackled with an update that sent a chill through Sarah's heart. Overwatch, we've got fighters within grenade range on our eastern perimeter. They're getting too close for your supporting fire. We're going to have to fight them hand-to-hand if they get much closer. Sarah could see the group,